Good evening. My name is Neil Hamamoto, and I'm the founder and artistic director here at Worthless Studios. I'd like to start by thanking you guys all for being here tonight. Tonight's program is our first of several public events being hosted this fall and winter in conjunction with our Artists in Residence program. In a moment, we will start the screening of The Art of Making It, which is a film that hits close to home for me in many ways. The Art of Making It is a film about who gets seen and who gets left behind in today's seductive, secretive, and unregulated art world. The film follows a diverse group of compelling young artists on the brink of unimaginable success or failure as they challenge systems, break barriers, and risk it all with the goal of making it in an industry where all the rules are being rewritten. 7 years ago, I had the bright idea of starting Worthless Studios to rewrite how public charities support artists with the central goals of building a physical space in Brooklyn to provide the space, tools, and materials that artists need to make work in this city. Over the course of our fledgling years, I am proud to say that we have done just that through our powerful public art projects like Free Film and the Plywood Protection Project, our large-scale immersive exhibitions like 1-800-Happy Birthday, and now with the launch of our Artists in Residence program. Thank you. Worthless Studios is a public charity that focuses on supporting emerging artists by providing all the resources they need. Worthless believes in more access to studio space, more materials, more tools, and more technical assistance so artists can make the work, so artists in this city can dream up and realize their biggest ideas. Tonight, encircled by the studio spaces of 5 emerging artists on their journey to make it, you couldn't have been placed in a better context for this film. Following the screening, we have the privilege of hearing from the movie's producer who is here with us tonight. Debi Wisch is a 25-year marketing and branding veteran and the producer of Emmy-nominated film, The Price of Everything. Debi was also an executive producer on Lisa Vreeland's Love, Cecily, and she recently produced a short film by the artist John Bach. Currently, Debi is producing Bury Me Standing with Jordan Peele. Debi serves on the Directors Advisory Board at Stanford University's Cantor's Art Center, Hunter College's Artists Advisory Board, the Board of Film at Lincoln Center, and the Board of Governors of the American Jewish Committee. She is also on the National Councils of Artadia and Anderson Ranch, and MoMA PS1's Greater New Yorkers. Debi, we are so thrilled to have you here tonight, and thank you for all you do to support the arts in New York City. Lastly, and finally, a thank you to Stanford University for your support, not only helping bring tonight's event together, but also for allowing Charlie, Kelcey, and me to graduate. The state-of-the-art fabrication resources and supportive staff that I had access to when I was on campus still serves as an inspiration and guide for the direction of Worthless Studios. Thank you all for being here again, and without further ado, The Art of Making It.
Scene or having a game. I don't play the system well at all.
Very few people are struck. You saying, how do we make it a fairer and better system?
It's not logical. It's not fair. And
first of all, I want to thank Neil Hamamoto and Sophie and everyone at Worthless Studios, not only for inviting us here tonight and persisting and hosting this extraordinary event, but for creating Worthless Studios, which in my mind is anything but worthless. And if you learned, if you have any takeaway from this film, I hope it's that the arts and artists in this country are entirely dependent on philanthropy and vision and people opening their hearts and wallets to create opportunity, because it's not something that's supported otherwise. So thank you. And I also want to acknowledge John Osthouse, who isn't in the film, but my dear friend, who I think kind of runs Stanford. Thank you for being here tonight. And then another Stanford luminary, Charlie Jarvis, who recently became the head of the wishful thinking tech department as we sat backstage trying to fill out forms for me. Charlie is a 2019 graduate of Stanford in computer science and studio art, which you're allowed to do together at Stanford. She grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this past year was in the Forbes 30 Under 30 for the extraordinary company she started called Fairchain, which is an artist-centered tech platform dedicated to providing equitable ownership infrastructure for the art market, very much aligned with our film's heart and mission. The company was founded with the goal of providing artists the opportunity to stay connected to their works financially and otherwise in an increasingly speculative art market, while providing essential support and protection to galleries and collectors. Since Fairchain's founding, they have sparked essential dialogue in the arts community with support and collaboration from many renowned members of the arts. And it's my great pleasure to present Charlie, who will moderate this evening's panel. And I just want to add that we have done maybe 36 festivals and many museum and university screenings. And the best pairing I've ever seen was one that happened to be between Felipe and Chris, who are here tonight. So thank you for being here. And it was at Doc NYC, and there were so many cast members on the stage. And my husband nudged me and he said, you know, if you can ever get the two of them, just the two of them and the director, that would be really good. So I hope this is an awesome discussion. No questions are off limits, and enjoy. And Charlie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name's Charlie, and I am the CEO and founder of Fairchain, not Worthless. And I'm on the board of Worthless, and we are so happy to be working with Worthless on this. I think one of the most interesting kind of takeaways from the film was that in a country in which there is not as much support, government support for the arts, there's so much opportunity for private initiatives to really make a difference. And I think that Neil and I are both really aligned on kind of our desires to really understand how we can participate in the art ecosystem in a way that feels meaningful. And so having conversations like this is a really good opportunity for us to kind of get there. So thank you guys for participating. This is going to be really fun. I am such a big fan of the two people sitting next to me right now. And I guess everyone got introductions to them already, but I guess we can hop in. We'll talk a little bit about what it means to make it as an artist and build your career, especially in New York, and their experience kind of going through school, the gallery system, the institution system, a little bit of everything. So, Chris, you're going to start. Chris, you recently had a sold-out show at Well and Cora that was named one of the best booths at Frieze LA in 2023. You are a 2022 to 23 Soros Justice Fellow, and your work has been exhibited in national and international institutions, all since the making of this film. I'm really curious, given the name of the film, what you would define as making it. You've done so much since the film has been made, and so I'm curious about what success really means to you.
I always feel like that's a heavy, very loaded question, because I think it tends to be a very philosophical question, at least for me. Like, making it tends to be just finding a place of happiness in life in general. Thinking about what has happened since the film, I always kind of laugh about like everything that happened before the film, which I think all the artists that were kind of curated by Debi and Kelcey for this opportunity were already in a place of growth. And so I don't know. People always ask me, they're like, oh, like, have you gotten a lot of opportunities since the film's come out? And I'm always like, we were already kind of in the midst of doing the thing whenever the film came out. I mean, Felipe was, correct me if I'm wrong, but the biennial happened, like that was already kind of in the works before the film was even released. So even my solo show with, my first solo show in New York even was already kind of in the works before I even had the opportunity to meet Kelcey. So, at the end of the day, it's thinking about all the things that you've done to kind of contribute to not only the art field, but just to yourself. And if you're able to be able to go to sleep at night, I mean, that's success for me.
Cool. I'm going to weave in a little intro of Felipe now. Since the film, you had your work featured in the Venice Biennale, in the Milk of Dreams exhibition, which was amazing. You've done residencies at Next Haven, the Getty Research Institute, and I believe you're going to Anderson Ranch next, correct? And so for you, having kind of seen this whole system through from, being in art school and going through the gallery system, having experiences at residencies and institutions. I know you recently actually did a public art project in which you have paintings of yours up at bus shelters around a bunch of cities. Everyone should check it out. It's Boston, New York, Chicago, Mexico City, and more. What to you feels meaningful as you think about the way that you've gone through this art ecosystem?
I guess ultimately it's like staying true to myself and to the practice, right? I think being transparent that we're talking about a very specific art world, that there are many art worlds within this art world, right? There are many bubbles. But I guess to that, it's been obviously a learning process, right? I think we're in such a murky world, right? That at times it feels like there's, I guess I could come from my personal experience of school, that I feel like undergrad was an extremely transformative space. And I never had a desire to go to graduate school. And the only reason I went to graduate school is because I just needed the time and space. And that was 10 years later after I graduated undergrad. And we both went to a very particular grad program, and we could get into that. But I think I'm only saying this because I felt like I wanted to go to grad school to also find that community that I felt I had in undergrad. And that grad program was quite the opposite. In many ways, it kind of showed me the sort of the murky world that people, it was like a rat race, if that makes any sense. But even from there, I was just staying sort of grounded. And I think part of it is like, it's been a learning process, right? I think it's a world full of secrecy, right? And I think it's also ultimately also building a community of people you trust, right? Who are also here to support you and be your cheers. But ultimately, I think part of it is just like anything. It's been a learning process. There's sort of no guide to how to do this whatsoever. And I think, ultimately, what I want to do is protect that practice, right? And obviously, I don't work with a team, and obviously there is a demand. And I think it's also about finding that middle ground, right? Where I feel like nor could I meet a demand because the work doesn't allow that. But I think, it's been, in many ways, so many great things have happened in the past 3 years, but also I think I've had a studio practice for the last 4 years. So it's very, very fresh for me.
And I think one thing that I love about this film as well is that there's a lot that is not talked about around how the art world works. And I think at times it's very intentional. And everyone in the film was very candid about a lot of the things, for better or for worse. What are some of the things that you were excited that you were able to kind of bring to light as part of your participation in the film?
I think things are still kind of candid and secretive. I don't know. I watched the film. I've seen the film since, and even if I'm watching the film with peers, they're kind of like still asking a ton of questions. And I think that's a sort of beauty about the film, is that it provokes this kind of curiosity to continue engaging into this conversation of what's going on, why did that happen? Because it doesn't really kind of say that verbatim. And so, I don't know if there's a lot of things other than the facts of, how many students from these prestigious institutions are kind of plucked and thrown into the kind of gallery systems, which, when you're at Yale, like we're totally aware of that, and if you didn't know that prior to going there, you learn very quickly. Whether there's alum coming to a visit and there's conversations about what to do or how to do. I don't know if there was a lot of things from the film that I personally learned, or I was like, oh, well, this is great that the world gets to know this. I think it's great for those who have not had any introduction or any involvement to these world. I think the film is wonderful for them because they're kind of like, oh, this is how it is. And I'm like, yeah, this is terrifying, like how it is. But then there's moments like these where I guess you guys will kind of have the opportunity to ask us questions about these kind of candid moments.
And you actually bring up a great point, which is that especially both of you went to Yale, and there is definitely a practice of people going to studios and buying a lot of works from grad students, knowing that a few years down the line they'll be worth a lot more. And I imagine that is very much kind of a harsh wake-up call to experience that, right? You move from focusing on the practice to suddenly being pushed out into the market. Could you tell us more about what that feels like to suddenly think about your work as kind of an object or vehicle of potential speculation or a commodity?
I'll let you take that one because I wasn't there long enough to kind of enjoy that.
I think it was interesting to navigate that, right? Because I think, like Chris said, I think obviously I knew what I was getting myself into. I had peers of mine from Cooper that had gone through that program at different stages, right, from undergrad or a bit after. So I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. But what I would say before answering that is that I went into that program knowing, well, first of all, I went to Cooper at a time where it was fully funded. And the only reason that I could attain higher education was because of that. I was coming from a very weird immigration status that didn't allow me to basically apply for financial aid at that time. So I knew the importance of going to get a free education. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. So the only reason I went to Yale was because I basically got fully funded. And I wouldn't have gone to grad school if that wasn't the case, right? And I basically treated that program as a 2-year residency. And I mean, since I left that program, I've been very vocal about how I feel about that program. That I don't think it's a great program. And maybe it was at a certain time, but I also, to its defense, I would say that program changes every year, right? I mean, I feel like when I was there was a huge transformation where sort of the old dinosaurs were leaving and there was sort of new, fresh energy. But at the same time, that program is constantly changing every year. There's 23 new students coming in. There's a very different energy. So I kind of feel like my 2 years there, I experienced the good and the bad of that program. But then as you mentioned, obviously there are people coming in and out. And whether you like it or not, that program gives you a visibility whether your work is great or not, right? And some of my peers actually saw some validation in already being in that program, which could really mess up with your mind. And you think, I already have it all lined up. I'm gonna, get a gallery or get a show after I graduate. But I think those are the things that mess up sort of your time there. I feel like, I mean, for me, it was extremely transformative to right away know what I wanted to get from there. And basically, I mean, I didn't have a studio practice prior to that program. I had never had a space dedicated to making and thinking that wasn't my bedroom, right? So for me, that was transformative to have that space and to actually have people continuously, you know, during the week come to my studio and talk and have critiques, right? But then we have these like massive pit crits, that's another conversation, but that are very performative. But I mean, yes, there are people walking around, curators walking around, collectors walking around, buying. And I mean, ultimately I needed money at that time, and I did sell stuff that I wish I had not sold.
Why do you wish you hadn't sold it?
Well, I mean, to depends. I didn't have money, right? And I think, I mean, obviously, I was very aware that I was selling to specific people, right? And I had conversations with these people. But I mean, I think it's not because I felt like those people weren't the right people. I feel like those pieces were just meant to stay with me for longer. But I mean, lucky for me, I didn't have enough work. So but that's the one thing. But I mean, I did hear the stories from a lot of my peers, right? Of, you know, collectors sort of, I wouldn't say their names because there's a specific couple that walks around in a lot of grad school programs, especially in the East Coast. And I had them in the studio, and basically they told me, you know, you want to be on my wall. And that's sort of the sort of conversation I need to hear for me to realize that I don't want to be on their wall. And you have those people coming in now, I think.
And just because I'm curious, has anyone in the audience been to an MFA program? Show of hands. Okay, amazing. Chris, you had a really interesting experience with your MFA program. And I hear you are very forthcoming about telling us the details of what happened. I think you told me that. Tell us more about your time at Yale, and also tell us more about what you did get out of that program, and what did feel valuable from being there.
It's really interesting to hear your story because I didn't know what a studio visit was prior to going to Yale, but I very much had a practice. Before going to, or even thinking about applying to grad school, I was already having solo shows and residency opportunities. But I was also working out of my 1-bedroom apartment because I didn't have furniture in my living room. And I was like, oh, this is a perfect place for a studio. So when I was in Charlotte, that was my studio. I was still bartending at the time. Then in Charlotte, having a 1-bedroom was only like $500. So it was a sweet deal for me to really kind of consolidate money. But my time in undergrad, I had I went to school for 2 BFAs with the sole intention to never go back to school ever again. I was like, this is going to be it for me. I get 2 degrees. I'll be a designer and also be a studio artist. This is perfect. And then I tried to work at a design firm. I was like, I can't handle people telling me what to do. So that was short-lived. And then I fell in love with what I was doing. And I think at that time, having gotten residencies really early on, like immediately after undergrad, I think that was wonderful for me because I had the opportunity to be surrounded by older established artists, but also there's something about the momentum to be like, oh yes, you can do this. You actually belong here. And it wasn't until I had an opportunity to have a solo show at Davidson College that I met a Yale alum, and this Yale alum gave me one of the biggest compliments to this day about my work. And she walked up and she's like, I really love your work. And I was like, thank you. And she goes, where did you go to school to get your MFA? And I was like, not something I'm thinking about. She was like, you should. She wrote a recommendation for me. The rest is history. But the reasons for me going to Yale wasn't so much to get an MFA, but it was for a community. And at the time, I was kind of like, if this is where some artists that I highly respect went, I would love to be in the room with other people who are possibly on that level. And so that was kind of my insight. Whether I wasn't hung up on finishing and being an art star, and I was just like, it'll be amazing just to be surrounded around these minds that I couldn't find in Charlotte, North Carolina. Like really kind of motivated peers. What happened after that was kind of being introduced into a world where I showed up with the sole intentions of tearing my work apart. I think that was already the goal in my head. I was making, I think there's images of that work in the film. I was making really figurative work at the time, and I had gotten really comfortable making that work. Like I could make that work with my eyes closed, and I was like, this is a perfect opportunity for me to really challenge myself. And I feel there was some early pushback from faculty members that I was already kind of ahead of that curve. I think they wanted to have their hands in that, right? There's this kind of model with the faculty then, because Felipe's right, there's a constant turnover with faculty members unless their tenure group is really small. And so it's always fresh people, fresh insight, different backgrounds coming in. And while I was there, it was kind of this idea that if we help you, if we tear you down and make you work hard, and then later on say, oh no, you figured it out, that they would be a part of your process. And since I didn't kind of allow that, and I was already like, hey, no, I already don't want to do that anymore. I want to take classes on film, or I want to take classes outside of the program to kind of further enrich interests that I had at the time. I think there was just overall pushback from the faculty. At least that's from my perspective, right? Because I still, to this day, don't know what conversations were being held about me. Other than incidences that happen in the pit crits, which are kind of, they're performative. You could be having a conversation with the professor in your studio 2 days prior to that, and they're like, oh, everything looks great, you're gonna do fine. And then that same professor will slaughter you in front of everybody. And you're like, wait, what's going on? And a lot of other people will tell you like, oh, well, MFA programs are critical and they're harsh. It's different. It's different when they're kind of attacking your character and what you should or should not be doing. For me, as an educational space, it doesn't seem helpful.
Nor healthy, I think, sadly, that's become the norm. And I don't want to say that's just Yale, because I've had other peers from other grad schools who have a similar experience, right? That I think the joke that I talk with all my peers is that we all are still carrying that trauma from Yale. And once someone starts speaking about our experience, everyone is like, all right, and literally, I think that's become the norm in that school. I can't say now because I'm not there, and hopefully it has changed. But the norm was to basically destroy you and tear you apart, right? And it was never a space for failure, which I feel like a grad school should be, or to embrace failure, right? And that's why I also had such a hard time in that program, that I did not click with not one person of faculty whatsoever. And I think the people that I clicked more were the people who were visiting from the outside. Like Chris, I myself got in trouble a lot because my second year, I decided to not see anybody in my studio. You're required to see a minimum of I don't know how many faculty in your studio. And I said, no, I don't want you in my studio.
Why not?
Why? Because there were conversations that, I mean, I've been very open about the certain like fucked up conversations I had in my studio. I mean, one artist, famous painter, telling me, Felipe, you've been served a silver platter. And I'm like, you're both queer and undocumented. That's a lot to work with. So like fucked up conversations like that are not they're not critically constructive in the studio, nor do I need them, right? And I think, I don't know if Chris had this issue, but there were a lot of people of color in that program whose work was being critiqued in a very, through like identity politics, right? Like not once was my work critiqued through materiality whatsoever. My work for them was very didactic. Once they somehow, but that is the art world, right? We live in an art world that wants to easily digest you. And what's more easily digestible? Oh, immigrant queer artists, right? And I think that is the battle that I've been battling before Yale, right? That for the longest, my work has always been described as like the undocumented artist, Felipe Baeza, or rather, Felipe Baeza, who happens to be undocumented, right? And I think, but I definitely saw that a lot in that school. And like Chris, I definitely pushed back. And maybe that's why they don't want to have me back there. But I do think like there are people there who are well-intentioned, and obviously it's hard to dismantle a system that was created in a very specific way, right? There are people there who I'm glad they're there, right? But I think the whole entire system needs to be dismantled.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that goes into that. And I mean, artists from across time have been talking about how it would be great James Baldwin talked about how it'd be great for him to just be a writer and not be a Black writer. And it feels unsurprising that at a private white institution, you are critiqued as an artist, very firmly tied to your race and other non-white parts of your identity. A lot of the critiques are about an institution that does have a lot of institutional weight, right? And that's been formed over years and years. But a lot of what you've pointed to as valuable aren't things necessarily tied to that institution. One thing that I know Neil and I have talked a lot about when it comes to Worthless, for example, is that New York is a place that has an amazing community of artists. And this is touched on in the video as well, the beauty of being an artist in New York and being able to kind of build your career in New York. What are ways that you feel like you're able to kind of go outside of these institutional frameworks and still kind of work to achieve success? And this is probably useful for you, but also for the other people within this room who might have gone to an MFA or might be trying to find a way through without going to that MFA to build their community.
I mean, I can only tell you from my personal experience, which is, I think, different than most people, unless you just did not go to an MFA program. You know, after my time in New Haven, because I ended up staying another year, New York was the last place I wanted to be because everyone wanted to go there. And specifically, everyone that was in New Haven, right? And so I moved to Paris. You know, it's kind of like, you know, a Dave Chappelle moment. No, thus Africa. And for me, it was thus Paris. I was like, they'll never understand. And whatever they're thinking I'm feeling or thinking, you know, about what I'm doing, you know, a bigger question is, like, for those who found a lot of success out of an MFA program, how do they critique the institution? Or do they critique the institution? Because I feel like my classmates who, what's that? Art stars, underline, bold. You know, like a lot of my peers are art stars. Love them dearly, but they're art stars. Would they have sacrificed that piece of paper to stand up for something they believed in? I don't know. So I think it's easier to ask people who maybe struggled or pushed back. I'm like, oh, well, how do you reframe all of this? How do we reframe it? You know, ask those who took advantage of that situation and are still taking advantage. So when you ask this question of, well, if you're in New York, how do you move through that? For me, it was quite difficult coming back because I know that like I was kind of red flagged. And so while I had to create, maybe this is the appropriate answer for this, I had to create another community. And one of my favorite communities was the Lower Manhattan Culture, the LMCC. I did that maybe 2 years afterwards. And I think that was like one of my first communities outside of my Yale MFA community. And I felt like it was a fresh place for me to start because they just saw me as someone who made these paintings, right? It was also something I didn't really advertise. I can, you know, they'd be like, oh, where'd you go to school? I'm like, I went to school to Yale. What class were you at? 2014. And they're like, oh, I know so-and-so. I was like, me too. And kept it moving, you know? But I think, like for me, it was just like creating these small pockets of new communities, kind of keeping my head down and just like really just focusing on my studio practice. And unlike those who came out of the program as, you know, firing straight out of the cannon, I kind of had to start all over, you know, with like meeting new curators and going out and mingling and associating myself in the art world while also managing 3 to 4 bartending gigs. So it's like, where do you find a time to be in the studio, right? And you have to do all this extra stuff. And so I didn't really kind of gain any really exhibition momentum until 8 years afterwards, 7, 8 years afterwards.
And what did it take to get that exhibition momentum? Was it the relationships you were forming in New York once you were kind of back to building a community here? Yeah, perseverance. You know, like not saying no. Like there was something, I won't say any names, but there was something that was said to me on the way out the door at Yale. And it was someone who kind of was like the overseer of all the students, right? And she was a Yale graduate. You might know who she is. And she looked at me and she was like super upset, you know? She was just like, you know, Chris, you're young. You can be anything. You can go to school and be a doctor. You can be anything. And I was like really offended by that. I was just like, you don't see me. Like I'm here not for fame. I'm here because this is what I am. And I kind of took that with me, and there was nothing else for me to do. There's nothing else for me to do. And so it was, if this would have taken 20 years, then so be it, you know? As long as I had the opportunity to do it my way. Thank you. And Felipe, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it hasn't been easy, right? I think my trajectory in many ways has been obviously a very specific one, right? The reason I came here, as I said, was, you know, when I applied to Cooper, I didn't know what Cooper Union was, right? Until I got here, I realized, well, I'm in a really special place. But also knowing that when I left, I didn't have any debt, you know? And I stayed in New York and I survived, and I, you know, was in the service industry for like 70 years, working out of my bed, working for artists as assistant, and I never had any sort of desire to go to grad school, right? I just had a desire to survive and do whatever I could do in New York, and eventually I ended up getting an amazing job at a print shop called Two Palms in the city.
I love Two Palms.
And to this day, I love Two Palms, and And it was there at that time, 2014, because I applied 2 times to grad school, that I just kind of feel like I needed that break to focus on my work, right? And I didn't go to grad school, and I want to be transparent that I never have, and to this day, don't have a desire to teach. As we know, there's a amount of people who teach and who shouldn't be teaching, but and I think that the idea of the MFA has changed, right? I remember when I was in undergrad, people went to grad school to teach, right? And I think in my time around when people were applying for grad school, that wasn't the conversation, right? And I think I definitely saw grad school as an opportunity for this sort of 2-year time block for me to just focus on my work, right? And luckily that program itself served as that space because it was a studio-based program that offered me that space. But even so, it hasn't been easy since then. I think it's been obviously a lot of learning, but also unlearning, right? Especially for myself to learn that my favorite word is no, right? But also in many ways, going back to what Chris said, I think building community has always, I feel like New York is home now, because I built that community. And that community for me was people that I work with in restaurants. And to this day, those are like my best friends, right? I mean, I left Yale with maybe 4 solid friendships, right? And I think, I'm still trying to, there's a lot to learn with this process. I mean, as I said, it's been obviously a lot in the making for this to happen, right? And at the same time, I think when I first, I left Two Palms, it was kind of hard for me because I was like, wait, I'm going to really precarious. I don't know if this is going to work out. Like, who's going to pay for the studio? And it's also like been having to find that balance, right? That it's still ongoing, if to be honest.
Thank you. And we are I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we're gonna have a special guest join us for a Q&A. My last question is, everyone here today definitely cares a lot about the arts community and being engaged in meaningful ways. After having seen this film and after having had the opportunity to hear from you all, what is one thing that you think is a takeaway as far as how we can engage or work towards changing the art ecosystem in a more positive light?
Well, I guess for me, accessibility, right? I always speak that I didn't grow up going to museums. I come from a family, I was just in Chicago last week, a few days ago, and I took my parents to the museum for the first time. I think for a lot of communities, those spaces feel very uninviting. And to a lot of us, I can imagine everyone here has gone to a museum, right? And we never think it twice how to navigate a museum. But there's a lot of people out there who feel very intimidated to walk into a museum. Wait, what do you mean? How do you access? How do you move around? And I think the other factor, well, there's 2, is time. Like, who has time to spend 2-3 hours at a museum? That is a privilege. And the second one would be financial means. Like, who has $30 to pay to go to MoMA? So definitely accessibility is, for me, the biggest issue, and how to open these like wide wall spaces to the population that lives around you, right? So I think for me, I grew up in Chicago, and there was sort of an excess of culture that I felt growing up. I feel like I always speak about this, that I'd never experienced Mexico until I left Mexico and ended up in Pilsen in Chicago, right? Because this is just an abundance of this idea of what one Mexico is, right? In an almost kitschy way. But I remember growing up in the 90s, there's just this excess of culture and art everywhere. There's actually a free public museum a block where I live called, I'm sure they changed their name now, but it was the National Mexican Museum of Art. And that was sort of my first encounter with art. And for me, it was really transformative as a 9-10-year-old, right? To have that space for me to see work that I didn't really comprehend, but I was attracted to. So I think there's a lot to dismantle within institutions, but I think that's the one thing I can think about.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback that because you said that, and like so many things popped up for me, like my mom hadn't seen like a contemporary exhibition. I took her. Like I was, she had never seen a museum exhibition before, you know, growing up in High Point, North Carolina. I took her, and this had to have been like 8 years ago, but I took her to go see Julie Moretu's solo show at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And she was just like, wow. And I was like, yeah, Mom, this is like what I do, you know? She was like, oh, okay. My dad thought I was an architect up until 3 years ago. So you think about like access, it's generational too, you know? Like I didn't grow up going to museums. I think the closest museum to my house was a old furniture museum. I'm from High Point, North Carolina, so I don't know if you guys know anything about High Point, but it's the furniture capital of the world. We can talk about that later. So yeah, like having that access culturally, especially to, you know, lower income, brown, Black communities, like I think is really important. But after having spent half my summer in Berlin, thinking about artists as small businesses, like I think having the time to spend doing your work, I think is also really important. And in Germany, like it's easy for you to apply as a small business, and the government will literally give you money to live off of until you establish yourself as making enough income in your small business before they kind of release you into the world. And that means even if you're an artist. And I think that would be amazing, because I think that answers the time question, at least when it comes to making. So you're not juggling, at least in my case, 3 or 4 bartending gigs, and finding that time to muster up the energy because you're paying 2 rents. And you have to like, hey, well, I have to go to my studio and do something because I'm paying for it, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you guys. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, now we have a very special guest. We're going to have a Q&A, and Kelcey Edwards, who's actually the director of the film, is going to come up and join us for the Q&A. Kelcey, I'm going to say a little bit about your bio very quickly. So Kelcey is a filmmaker, author, and curator. She has an MFA from Stanford, which seems to be the theme for the night. And she has had documentaries screened at South by Southwest, Silver Docs AFI, Discovery Channel Film Festival, and True False. She's currently in development on a television pilot and documentary series. And she recently filmed a profile of artist Frank Stella for Artist Rights Society. There's a lot more, but I think we should skip to ask some questions. So we'll take just a few questions from the audience. You can just raise your hand and I'll maybe call on you.
I'll ask a question then. Okay. So I have heard from a number of people. Our film is on Kelcey and Emmerich Pontus, and a number of people who saw the film during its initial run have said that it feels even more powerful 2 years later, which probably is what it means to an artist when people live with your work and it's valued and increases on an emotional level just because they become so connected. But why do you think that it resonates even more now, 2 years, 3 years out of the pandemic?
That's a great question, Debbie. Thank you. Well, I hope, there's something that Chris said earlier about how this film was intended to be a kind of conversation starter. And sometimes the criticisms are along the lines of, you don't offer the solutions. And, I kind of feel like, well, I'd love to have fixed the art world in 90 minutes. That'd be amazing. But it's not, there aren't easy answers because they're not easy problems, and they're systemic problems, and they're societal problems, and they have a lot to do with barriers to entry that are a result of the society that we live in. And that's kind of, a lot of those themes are what you're tackling in your work. And, they're uneasy conversations to have when, the very, it's socioeconomic disparity, right? So it's like, I think I made the film in part because like any artist, I think part of you is kind of making what you want to have exist in the world for some reason. And, my father was a museum curator. I grew up in the art world. I'd seen a lot of art documentaries and was super disappointed in them. I felt like they were either really boring kind of cardboard biopics or about scandal, forgery and theft and, just the kind of, sensationalized art world. And I wanted something that had a serious, caring conversation about what's problematic about it, but put the beating heart of the art world at the center of the film to remind everyone that that's what this is all about, really, the makers and their well-being. And I think it's still refreshing to see a film like that, actually, because there aren't a lot of stories like that being told. And so my hope in leaving it, as a conversation starter is that more films like this will be made. You could make, a whole film about any of these topics, and people should keep figuring out how to improve it, because institutional change is slow, but societal change is even slower. But it starts with those really hard conversations, trying to hold people accountable. And sometimes when I think about what is this film really about, so we kind of joked it was a film that pretended to be about the art world, but really it's a film about capitalism. And I think it's a film about people who are willing to speak truth to power at the end of the day. And that's what our world needs right now. So one of the joys of making this film was actually how relieved every single person I spoke to was to be saying things, finally, that they knew to be true that you don't normally feel like you can say. So I think that's why it continues to resonate. Oh God, do I have to choose? Okay, third row, there.
So my question is, amazing film, created with congratulations. And second of all, how did you choose these two amazing artists to be featured?
Casting is tough. I mean, for any film, casting is casting. With a documentary, you're looking for real people cast. So there was a lot of research involved. I think we looked at the profiles. In fact, we have another wonderful cast member. I gotta call you out. Nick Cueva, come up here. Come. Nick is in the house. Speaking of wonderful cast. And, I think documentary is just like narrative, and that you're looking for people who have a lot of heart that you connect with. But in a film like this that's meant to be, we never wanted it to be a regional story, right? It could be a New York story, so we're looking for people from different parts of the country making different kinds of work, a diverse cast. We're a pluralistic society, like we needed, a range of people. And even with all that, those parameters, we can imagine how many people. And so really, once you find one person, you sort of find somebody that seems to complement them, and you start to sort of, it's like putting together a dinner party where you want a really delicious conversation. And that extended not just from the artists, but also the supporting cast, And sometimes they're great voices, and people will say like, oh, well, why wasn't so-and-so in it? And it's like, well, it'll be kind of a bit of a duplication in this sense. So it's intentional, but it's also just sort of following your heart, Behind Neil. Okay, Neil.
I'll go quickly. Great movie. I actually watched it on the plane going to Turkey just a couple of months ago, and I was so glad I saw it because it made me feel time great, and it was incredible. And actually, the most memorable thing to me was the artist's experiences being a minority in the art world, as a fellow minority in the art world. And you said this thing about this movie speaking truth to the power. And that's a question to me every day as a minority artist in New York. I'm an immigrant from Iraq War, came here. I have so much student debt from undergrad. I've been making it through art residencies like WORTHLESSSTUDIOS right now. I'm one of the artists here. And that's been like really the only way to, navigate and like kind of like just be truthful to my work and not sell like too quickly just because like I needed to pay rent and like knowing to say no to things and whatnot. I'm just wondering, because everything in this market, in this art market, seems to be like a trend, and it's a trend that is actually like a little bit late to the truth. Like for example, what happened during the pandemic with Black Lives Matter and stuff, that's not new. That's just like a truth that was been told years and years ago, and then like finally like the people in the market who control the market are paying attention to it and using it in a way to continue doing what they're doing. I wonder, as an artist who's completely aware of this minority game and how this is like, I question doing an MFA at Columbia actually also, but I wouldn't want to do it if I had to like fall under this umbrella of like an immigrant Iraqi artist. Do you think that the market will pick up the new truth of if we keep speaking up of like instead of shuffling the hierarchy of instead of like the white man becoming the first and now the people of color being picked the first, instead of that, can we just like treat art as equal? Like, can we just see it as an equal lens? Do you think we'll get there? Do I have a hope?
That's a very good question. You know what, I think I'd like to hear Nick's response to this as somebody who curates and has done a lot of representing of emerging artists. Sounds to me like broadly like an emerging art question about trends and features and representation. What do you think, Nick?
Sure. So I think in terms of what you're talking about, it's hard to say, because you're coming from a specific perspective and whether or not that might have a time in the limelight of the art world. But you're also trying to say that that's also separate from the identity itself. And I think that's a very complicated thing because unfortunately, there are trends, there are fashions in the art world, and certain kinds of dialogue come into focus while other things kind of get blurrier as we like progress through time. Different types of conversation are more important, or not necessarily more important, but more relevant in the moment, right? So like when the Black Lives Matter stuff was exploding, granted, that's like 70 years, if not more, worth of real talk coming to light. But that was the time for it, right? Like there was a critical mass and the dialogue got to that point. So as you said, Iraqi, right? So I'm guessing we're entering an age where that conversation will become very relevant because the guilt that Americans and Europeans have over what was done to and for that area of the world will start to become something that it's not so now. And because it's not right now, we can talk about it without having like the actual tension that kind of thing brings to the room, right? That's unfortunately a big part of what's popular in the art world is that it has to be so far in the past that it can't actually affect us, right? Like we only can digest things that are safe, at least in the art world that deals with money and all this other stuff. There's many art worlds that aren't that, right? And there's dialogues and niches and groups that have been talking about this stuff for a long time. But when it comes to the larger moneyed things, it's typically, 20, 30 years after the thing that you're talking about is happening. So I'm not going to presume that your work is about your Iraqi heritage. But what I've seen in the art world is that even just the fact that you're Iraqi, like that will become the thing, like we've talked about, like that'll become your thing. And you'll be sold as that and packaged as that. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I mean, maybe that doesn't happen. Hopefully we enter an era that's not the case. But I don't really have faith that the art world is going to change anytime soon.
I mean, I get what I would say to that. I mean, I think it's such a fucked up burden to carry while you're making and thinking about these conversations that have nothing to do with you. But at the same time, these are real conversations, right? That I, for myself, there are specific ways to navigate that and contextualize the work to an extent, right? Outside of that, it's not my power, right? I don't know. I think it's a lot of burden to deal with those conversations in the studio, and I think for me, it has been healthy to protect the studio in a way where it doesn't get hijacked by money, right? But also being transparent that like I have to pay for the studio, like, and also building a healthy relationship to the studio, right? That I am making stuff that I'm interested in making, and I'm not just making stuff because someone wants to buy it, right? And I think we're going back to the conversation about being in New York, and doing it in New York is extremely hard because it's not cheap to rent a studio, and my studio is not like a huge, massive warehouse. I'm working with what I have, but I'm making it. But I think to your point, I don't know. I think then it becomes about something else. If you're asking yourself those questions, I don't know. For me, I don't find it healthy and as I mentioned, yes, there are specific conversations that are happening around my work and myself that I have no control over. And that's gonna happen no matter what, right? But I'm not gonna let that affect me. I think to an extent, I'm pushing the work and making the work and having the conversations that I need to have and making that visible, right? The other conversation is gonna happen no matter what, right? As I mentioned, you also were served the silver platter, and sadly, to a lot of people, we appear as that, right? That we have a lot of trauma to work with, right? And sadly, that is the art world, right? That our trauma is valuable in certain aspects, but I don't think it's sort of a healthy way of bringing that into the studio, if that makes any sense.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have. I wish we could stay forever. But thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you to the Worthless Studios team for hosting a wonderful evening. I'm going to give a special thank you to the inaugural Artist in Residency group who has let us actually come into their space that you can see all around. This is such an exciting program, and we're really happy to be able to be so close to a program that is trying to kind of solve a lot of these issues around making it feasible to be an artist in New York City. And I would be remiss to not say that you should consider making a donation to Worthless Studios. It's an incredible organization, and your donation helps continue programming like this, which is so impactful. So thank you, everyone.